This morning I want to invite you to hear the words from the book of Philippians, the 3rd chapter, verses 2 through 11. I'm going to be reading from Eugene Peterson's translation of the text from the Message. So if you're reading from a Pew Bible or if you're reading from another translation, it may not quite be the same. This is a more contemporary translation from Philippians 3, 2 through 11. And this is St. Paul writing to the church at Philippi and counsels them. Steer clear of barking dogs, those religious busybodies, all bark and no bite. All they're interested in is appearances, knife-happy circumcisers. I call them. The real believers are the ones the Spirit of God leads to work away at this ministry, filling the air with Christ's praise as we do it. We couldn't carry this off by our own efforts, and we know it, even though we can list what many might think are impressive credentials. You know my pedigree, a legitimate birth, circumcised on the 8th day, an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin, a strict and devout adherent to God's law, a fiery defender of the purity of my religion, even to the point of persecuting Christians, a meticulous observer of everything set down in God's law book. The very credentials these people are waving around as something special, I'm tearing up and throwing out with the trash, along with everything else I used to take credit for. And why? Because of Christ. Yes, all the things I once thought were so important are gone from my life. Compared to the high privilege of knowing Christ Jesus as my master firsthand, everything I once thought I had going for me is insignificant. I've dumped it all in the trash so that I could embrace Christ and be embraced by Him. I didn't want some petty, inferior brand of righteousness that comes from keeping a list of rules when I could get the robust kind that comes from trusting Christ, God's righteousness. I gave up all that inferior stuff so I could know Christ personally, experience His resurrection power, be a partner in His suffering, and go all the way with Him to death itself. If there was a way to get in on the resurrection from the dead, I wanted to do it. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. There are 3 things this morning that Paul lifts up in this scripture text for us to hear. And he talks about what he desires most of everything else in life. He said, I want to know Christ. I want to know the power of His resurrection. And I want to be a partner with Christ in His suffering. Now, I would say that is a very unusual statement for our day. In fact, if I were to design a sign that said, this line for suffering, and I were to come and hold it up and ask you to come forward and stand in line, I dare say not many of you would come stand in this line, would you? We just would not do it. Because none of us really want to suffer when we think about the suffering of Christ and the way that He suffered. And I hope later on it'll become clear to you that there's a way to share in the Christ suffering that may be a little deeper and richer than any of us realized. In today's culture, what we most likely might hear of a statement of desire would be along the lines of the following. I want to know success and the power of money. Or someone might put it this way. I want to know success and the power of my name recognition. Or what might you say? I want to know success and the power of, or what others can you hear others saying in the day in the culture in which we live? I want to know success and the power. Now, I do want to readily say that there's nothing wrong with success in life, and there's nothing wrong with the power that comes with that. Unless, of course, it's one's attempt to be successful, and it causes the ego to run riot. Hear that again. There is nothing wrong with being a success and the power that comes with it, unless, of course, in one's attempt to be a success, it causes the ego to run riot. Case in point. Some of you may recognize the face of the person on the screen this morning. That's Alex Rodriguez. He's known as A-Rod. He's a very, very outstanding baseball player for the New York Yankees. In case you aren't acquainted with him, there was an interview last Sunday evening on 60 Minutes where a guy by the name of Tom Bosch has accused Alice Rodriguez, or A-Rod, the third baseman of the Yankees, of using and taking performance-enhancing drugs. And, of course, you can imagine what A-Rod is doing. He's denying it to the nth degree. But Major League Baseball, for the most part, on Bosch's own word, has suspended A-Rod for a year or 162 games plus any postseason games the Yankees might play. And here's what I want us to think about success and the ego run riot. Someone can be good at something. I mean really good at something. And yet we know there is within us the capabilities, and it's been displayed in the world, that there's this inner beast that can raise its head, that can cause a person to do anything, and I mean anything, to be what they feel is the best for them. And we see this all the time. The most telling quote in that 60 Minutes interview was when Bosch said this. He said he, A-Rod, wanted to achieve all his human performance objectives. Now, the thing that's so ironic about this is that A-Rod was a great player from the time he broke into the major leagues at the age, get this, at the age of 19. But this is where things go wrong, friends. And it can go wrong for us. A-Rod wanted more. He always wanted more. He wanted to be more than he was. So then he went out and tried to buy it. Listen to these words. He coveted something beyond greatness. And when people, whether it's you or me or A-Rod or anyone else, when we begin to covet something beyond greatness, there will always be this insatiable desire for more and more and more. Success to the point of the ego running riot. Let me give you another example of someone. One of my favorite television shows that I used to watch, and I got so caught up in the characters. I mean, I really loved this show. I wouldn't miss it. It was every Thursday night. I think it came on at 9 o'clock. It was the show ER. And in that show, there was a Dr. Benton. Now, for those of you that may know Dr. Benton, he was a great doctor. He was just superb. But he had an ego about the size of the universe, if you remember him. And sometimes you'd get to think, well, I may like this guy. And then suddenly how that ego would just get so involved in him that you'd think, oh, you know, Dr. Benton. Well, one of my favorite scenes, favorite episodes of this was a time in his life when, as a doctor, he had gone in and had done a medical procedure on an infant. And everything that could go wrong, it seemed like did go wrong. And he knew he had really messed up. And you see him coming into this dark room, this light that kind of shines down on this infant that's incubated, and he leans over and he looks in, and you just see this on his face, like, oh my God, what have I done? And so he begins like this as he looks at the infant. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And then he stops. And then he begins again. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And then he stops again. And then in sort of a quiet whisper, you hear him say these words. My God, I forgot the words. A doctor that had it all going, a doctor who had such great medical prowess. But somehow the ego had become so great in him that he lost touch with something that he had a long time ago. But that doesn't just happen to A-Rod. It doesn't just happen to Dr. Benton. It can happen to any of us if we're not careful. But there's someone else that I want us to focus on this morning, and it's St. Paul. If we look closer here at the reading of the 3rd chapter of the book of Philippi and look deeply in at the character of Paul, we initially can see one who is what I call a squeaky clean, accomplished Jew. I mean, he has all the pedigree. In fact, he has bragging rights about his pedigree, and this is the way he wrote about himself. He said, "You know my pedigree, a legitimate birth, circumcised on the 8th day, an Israelite from the elite tribe of Benjamin, a strict and devout adherent to God's law, a fiery defender of the purity of my religion, even to the point of persecuting the church, a meticulous observer of everything set down in God's law." I mean, he had it. And we know, at least it seems to me, that down south we know about pedigrees, don't we? Huh? We say things like, "Who's your mama?" Huh? Yeah, who's his mama? Who's his daddy? Yeah, we want to know about pedigree because it's important. And it was important for Paul in the pedigree of who he was and from where he came from. However, we know that in the life of Paul, one day this person who had it all together and had all of his I's dotted and T's crossed had an encounter with Jesus Christ on the Damascus Road. And Paul was changed. And I'm not talking about just an itsy bit. Paul was changed. He experienced through Christ one who embraced him in spite of his ego or his bragging rights. Christ loved him. And he experienced one who offered to him utter forgiveness in spite of what he had done, even persecuting the church. And suddenly what he thought was success totally got inverted. It turned his world upside down to the point that he wrote in Philippians the 3 things that were most important to him. What he said was, "I gave up all this all this inferior stuff so that I could know Christ personally, that I could experience his resurrection power and be a partner in his suffering." Those 3 things. What if for you and for me, knowing Christ, the power of his resurrection, and partnering with Christ became the chief desire in our lives? What might that look like? And I would even go so far to say that when we talk about suffering, being partnered with Christ with his suffering, that I want to suggest to you that sometimes we have a very shallow view of what that suffering looks like. Now, most likely when we think about suffering with Christ, we think about his death on the cross and his life and how he lived it and how he was abused and so forth. But what if suffering is more than simply that for us today? What if our partnering with Christ in his sufferings, there's another added dimension to our lives that you and I can participate in that really would be participating and partnering with Christ in his suffering? What if this partnering with Christ in his suffering what if it was along the lines of some of the ministry that we look at here in the life of your church? What if it meant for you in some way to participate in the manna ministries of your church? You know, I can't imagine a person being involved in the manna ministries of this church, this type of servant ministry, not feeling compassion for those whose needs are at times are so great and resources are so few. I can't imagine sitting across the table from someone who comes in who is hungry or needs food or needs help with utilities or whatever y'all do in that ministry. I can't imagine being on one side of the table and looking the eyes and faces of these persons and that somehow that we suffer with them. That we partner with Christ in suffering as we reach out to these people. It just seems to me you have to be compassionate. You have that partnership with Christ in suffering when you do that. What about when you as a church participate in the Honduran mission trips or some other type of mission in your church where there's sweat and tears and time and resources and you expend it to partner with Christ in suffering as you go to other places of the world and you encounter people who have nothing like what we have. And in some way you provide resources. Maybe you provide vitamins, or maybe you provide inoculation for some baby or some child, or you help build something that will give them a place that's dry. Or can we not do? Isn't it when we engage in that we're partnering with Christ in his suffering? Because Christ calls us to be there in his name and to partner with him in his suffering. You see, if we only focus on Christ, the suffering of Christ, and think of how he died on the cross and the pain that he went through, and surely he went through pain. I don't discount that, but I'm saying there are other ways for you and me to partner with Christ in the sufferings of the world. What about participation in the Stephen ministries of the church? Giving of one's time to listen to another whose heart is crushed by grief or whose heart is devastated by unexplainable tragedy. And someone sits and listens and doesn't try to fix and shares in partnering with Christ in suffering to offer another one a listening ear and a word of hope. How many of you this afternoon, this day, this week, know someone that you could pick up and call on the phone and say, hey, I've been thinking about you? Or take a friend out for coffee and visit and reach across the table and take someone's hand and don't talk, but just listen. That is a way to partner with Christ in his suffering. And there's a word of caution I want to offer to all of us in this regard. I want to offer each of us something that's very real. It's something I experienced years ago. Years ago, when I was a senior pastor at University United Methodist Church in Baton Rouge, I was the youth group there every other year would go on something called ASP, or Appalachian Service Project. And some of you have heard of this. Some of you may have participated in it. And it's a great ministry where you go up in Appalachia and you do work up there. And so I was able to go on 2 mission trips with them. Now, this is the kind of the strange thing of the economy of things that sometimes don't make 2 + 2 = 4. When you covenant with ASP to go to some place where they need work done, and you go as a group, they'll send you and you'll sign a covenant, and they'll say, now, you covenant to give us $10,000, ASP. So you write a check, and it could be between $6,000 and $10,000. So you send them money, okay? Now, they take that money, and they go and buy building supplies that you provided for them to buy through your gift. And then you go up there, and then you take those building supplies, and you use them to do the work. I mean, isn't that kind of strange? You know what I'm saying? Shouldn't they be buying the supplies, and then in turn what you do, you go up there and work? No. You send them money, they buy the supplies, you go up there, you use the supplies that you had paid for, and you do the work. Well, the last ASP trip I went on with kids was up in Tennessee, and we were assigned to go out to a trailer and work, put skirting around the trailer, and also to build a front porch on the front of the trailer. And so Monday morning came, and we had made the trek from Saturday morning to get there, and got up Monday morning ready to go to work. So we get there, we drive up in the driveway where this place is. It was out in the middle of, I don't even know where we were. And so we get out of the van. There's 2 adults, and I think there's 4 kids, or 4 teenagers, and or maybe 5, and we get out of the van. Now, just as we get out of the van and begin to want to walk up the hill to where the trailer is, this wolf comes out. I mean, a real steely-eyed wolf. And, you know, it's like we're on dog. Any of y'all ever hunted with a bird dog? You just kind of go on point, and you don't move. And you know how big a wolf is? Bigger than you can imagine. And we just froze. And the lady from the trailer up top of the hill yelled down to us, "Oh, don't worry about him, he's tame." And we're kind of looking at one another, "Okay, you go first." So we gingerly make our way up to the top of the hill where the trailer is. Kind of a flat area up there where the trailer is that we're going to be working on. And I look. And this little Chihuahua dog comes out from the trailer, and he has 3 legs. Well, I've seen dogs with 3 legs before. And then there's this duck that is sitting in their front yard, pretty white duck, who I think was either sitting on eggs or whatever, stands up. And he begins to hop around on 1 leg. Now, my awareness is growing here. And then a little boy came up to me, and he said, "You want to see our hog?" Sure. So he took me around to the back of the house there where they had a hog pen back there, and there was this huge, I don't even know, 500, 600-pound boar hog. I mean, one of the biggest hogs I've ever seen in my life. And the little boy looked at me and said, "Guess what his name is?" I said, "What?" He said, "Bacon." Made sense to me. So we come back around the front of the trailer there, and standing in the door of the trailer is a beautiful little 18-month-old girl, blonde hair, blue eyes, and she is absolutely butt naked. Now, I was raised in the country, so I've seen and experienced a lot of stuff, so it didn't really, in any way shock me. But some of these kids that lived in Baton Rouge all their life and had never even seen the country, they could not imagine this. Well, we began our work. We put the skirting around the trailer. We built a porch on the front of the trailer. And one of the major tasks that we had to do before we could actually begin building it was setting 7 post holes, of course with posts in them, 24 inches deep in mountainous rock. It's not like when it rains here, a couple hours and you go out with a post hole and you dig down to the center of the earth, because it's so soft. I mean, and I don't know how many of you know what a spud bar is. I was on the end of a spud bar for 4 days. You need to look that up if you're not used to that very common, simple tool. But it took us a while. But we got the post set, we built the porch, everything was ready. So we come to the last day, and I'm visiting with the lady of the house. Now, when you go off on these mission trips and some things like this, you can begin to feel pretty good about yourself. Well, we just done such a great job here, and aren't we good, great people, and I'm telling you, aren't we great? And you don't really mean for your ego to run riot, but if you're not careful, it can, for all the good things that is done. And I must admit to you, that day I was feeling pretty good about our work. So I got to talking to the lady that was there at the trailer, and I asked her, the 4th of July was coming up, and I said, "Well, the 4th of July is coming up. What are y'all going to do anything special for the 4th of July?" And she just beamed. "Oh, yeah." She said, "We do something special every 4th of July." So we go on a trail ride. And my husband and 4 kids, we rolled up in this wagon, and we hooked the horse up to it, and she pointed the horse out in the pasture, who had all of his legs. And she was just beaming. And I said, oh, so y'all do that every year? She said, every 4th of July. We do this with friends of ours. Load the wagon up, go on a trail ride. We have the great time, she says. I said, really, every year? She said, yes. She said, we do this every year because every year we get together, we do this, and we raise money for St. Jude's. And then I felt about this tall. And the point I want to make here, friends, is that all of us, if we will not let our ego get us and not let our ego run riot, we can experience the same thing that Paul wanted in his life more than anything. The power of Christ and knowledge of Christ and partnership with Christ in his suffering.